Am I actually getting pretty interested in these books? I must be. Moonstruck by Onley James is the next entry in the Necessary Evil series. It follows the character of Jericho and Atticus, Atticus being the resident psychopath, as Atticus meets Jericho in the middle of a murder in a sort of meet cute but with psychopaths. And the two of them hit it off and end up striking up this really unlikely romance. And this is going to be my first video of trying this out with a different kind of format. I've decided to sort of do my reviews now with four core categories. So we're going to have characters, we're going to have plot, we're going to have pacing, and we're going to have world building. And world building is also including sort of setting, how realistic it feels, and how in place in the world it does. I'm just going to try this ranking system a little differently, and then I'm going to create like an average of each one being ranked between like 1 to 5. So I'm going to start off first with characters. I gave characters in this a 4 out of 5. I feel like there are some really interesting ones in here. I think Jericho in particular is sort of a bit of a show stealer in this one. He sort of manages to be the most interesting part of this book, even though this book is supposed to be centered more around Atticus. It feels more like Jericho is the much more interesting character, but that sort of reflects a trend in these books in which the sort of spouses or the potential, partners and stuff are actually the more interesting characters. I think the problem with having everyone be a psychopath is that you can only be a psychopath in so many different ways, and we're starting to see the limitations of that because Atticus seems to have a lot of crossover with August in the way that he behaves. He's sort of cold, a little distant, sort of unaware of sort of social norms in a sense. And that sort of reflects in this. It's why I can't really give this book a 5 for its characters, because the rest of the content in relation to the characters is actually very interesting. And then obviously Atticus is supposed to be the main character in this book, but he sort of takes a backseat to Jericho just because he's kind of a less interesting character. He's very stuck up, very tightly wound, and he is sort of afraid to open himself up to others, which is sort of how I could have described every psychopath up to this point. That's kind of where I encounter an issue with his character. He's just a little too bland, and then when you try and put him up beside someone like Jericho, who is so full of life and so full of character, it sort of creates this issue where Jericho is outshining who is supposed to be the star of the book. And it creates an inconsistency there. It's not to say that Atticus is totally boring. He's not totally without his own characteristics and traits. For example, Atticus is very prideful. He's sort of afraid to be seen as weak in any kind of way, and he takes like personal shame in that and is very easily embarrassed. It's often commented on by Jericho and his brothers that Atticus sort of blushes a lot because he gets very embarrassed in different situations. And he's actually a lot softer than the other brothers in this book. I think it's more down to this idea that Atticus is a very touch-starved person, and he never got the sort of love and affection that he would have craved from a father figure or from a family. And so he just sort of had to settle for repressing all that down and just going without. Whereas Jericho realizes that and opens him up to different experiences. Jericho especially is sort of the star of the show here. He is this kind of bad boy, chilled out kind of vibe to him. Even though under the surface, he sort of has this anger simmering from everything that's happened in his past. He's very well flushed out. You get an idea that he wasn't always like this, but his circumstances have sort of turned him into what he is, which is a bit different from Atticus, who was essentially born the way he was. So it's sort of nature versus nurture. Would Atticus have turned out different if he was nurtured a little differently? That's sort of brought up in this book as well. And it's done through the guise of Jericho and him sort of realizing that Atticus is a little different from a typical psychopath. He has a little bit too much empathy for people to actually be considered fully psychopathic. And it brings up a very interesting scene between Jericho and Thomas Mulvaney, in which Jericho sort of questions Thomas's not so much ethics, but more his infallibility, his certainty that the boys that he chose are actually psychopaths, because according to Jericho, Atticus exhibits non-psychopathic behavior all the time. And it's not just, I can feel more than one emotion, I just can't feel empathy. Atticus does actually show Jericho empathy in this book, and I think that's where that challenge sort of comes from, and it makes us question Thomas as a character as well. Now, the romance in this book can only really be described as insta love. They meet in this sort of murder cabin where they're basically both chasing the same target, and as a result of that, the two of them have this sort of erotic encounter, and then they swear to never meet each other again, or rather Atticus does, and then proceeds to spend the rest of the book trying to find Jericho and to be around Jericho in whatever way he wants, going as far as offering up the resources of the Mulvaneys and all their secrets to Jericho on a silver platter without really having to fight for it in any kind of way. It's fun in certain elements, it's a rushed in others, but I do feel that the two of them work because they both sort of cover for each other's weaknesses. Atticus has this need to be sort of petted, sort of given physical affection, and to be sort of have the reins taken out of his control and put into the hands of somebody else. He likes to be cared for, and he has that need that hasn't been met up to that point, and Jericho fulfills that role very nicely for him. And in contrast to that, Jericho loves to look after people. He likes to be the protector, the dominant in any relationship. And that comes from his sort of history from the loss of his family. Jericho has gone through quite a bit. He's lost quite a few people, and he has that sort of protective instinct in himself now, in which has driven him to begin killing people in the first place. And yeah, he finds a sort of outlet for that within Atticus himself. And that's where the two of them sort of shine for each other. They sort of let each other open up in ways that are important for their own personal development. Now, I'm going to move on from characters and move on to the plot. The plot in this one centers around Jericho's sister, who has shown up missing. She was found in a river with her, I think it was her kidney cut out of her body, which already is an interesting premise. But on top of that, she was sort of a drug addict before any of this happened, and it was assumed that she sort of ran away from home or got involved in a bad crowd, and her showing up years later then, sort of completely healthy, except for being dead and missing a liver, was very, very suspicious. And the mystery of the plot then starts to unfold from there. That's sort of the sparking moment for encouraging sort of Jericho to pursue this, but it also gives a reason for Atticus to offer his services and be around Jericho to help solve these murders. And yeah, it's really, really interesting. I like the way this plot unfolds. I think some of it does drag out just a wee bit too much, but that's not too bad whenever you consider the sort of mystery element of it and the uncovering of the mystery as it goes on. But I will say this, the ending of this book is sort of a bit of a non-starter. It's not so much that the climax is bad. You have a sort of more action-packed one than we usually get. But to go with that, there are sort of two characters you say are our main antagonists, and there's just no real emotional connection between them and any of the actual main cast of characters. Obviously, these people are responsible for Jericho's sister, but at the same time, there's no real personal connection or personal conversations between Jericho and those two people. Like, he isn't really involved with them in any way. They just know that this is his sister's killer and he needs to get rid of these people. But that connection where they are personally tied to the main characters, it's just not there. Whereas in the first two books, you had that. You had Noah's sort of a gross uncle, and you also had then Lucas's serial killer following him around. There are personal connections there to the main villain that sort of give it a bit more tension towards the end. Whereas in this one, it just didn't quite feel the same. And then the author sort of had to come up with a different way of building tension into a scene like that. And yeah, in the end, it just would have been better off if they had to develop that relationship a bit better with the villains rather than relying on a sort of Deus Ex Machina towards the end of the book. And that brings me on to pacing. Pacing was pretty okay in this book. You're not really going to struggle to get through this book at all. It's a very easy read. There's nothing really that stands out to me as particularly bad. I would say middle sections of it are a bit slower. They take time to sort of focus on the relationship between Atticus and Jericho in this, and that's fine. I think it can drag on a little bit, and I feel like because they're so insta-love, the sort of tension that could have been there is taken out. So you don't have that sort of pushing along the story like you would in other books. But yeah, I think it was perfectly fine. There's nothing really wrong with the pacing. There's nothing particularly right with the pacing. yeah, it's just a nice steady book. You're not going to struggle with it, and yeah, it flows in a nice organic way. The world building is interesting in this one because it finally introduces the gang, Jericho's gang, these sort of vigilantes of their own specific community that sort of parallel the Mulvaney family in a sense that Jericho has started this sort of neighborhood watch, as they like to put it, in which they look after vulnerable members of the community and get rid of people who are sort of preying on the weak. And there is a sort of justice in that. That's a less sort of scientific and methodical approach than Thomas has implemented, but the parallels are very interesting between the two groups and how they function. Jericho's was done more out of necessity and love rather than sort of lofty ideals that Thomas has and an effort to change the world as a whole. Jericho just wants to protect his own little bubble. And on top of that, we get introduced to some really, really fun side characters. Felix, in particular, I'm so looking forward to his book with Abby because their personalities are just going to clash in such a fun way. I'm just really looking forward to that part of it. Yeah, there's lots of little small elements. You start to see sort of holes in Thomas's persona in the way that he presents himself and in this experiment, and makes you doubt him a little bit as a reader as well. All that's excellent stuff. The plot definitely fits in this book. It doesn't feel out of place. And yeah, the world building is just sort of consistent. There's nothing too wrong about it, nothing too right about it. Again, it's very middle of the road, this book, with a lot of it. I would say the only thing that really shines in this book properly is the characters, but the rest of it is sort of, yeah, middle of the road. So now I'm going to move on to my ranking. So for characters, I give this a 4 out of 5. I think that's pretty fair. For plot, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Yeah, I just feel like there were elements that could have been better in this book, but yeah, it is what it is. I did enjoy the mystery element of it. I just felt that the ending could have been a little bit better. And then for the pacing, yeah, it's just pretty middle of the road, pretty average, and so I give it a 3.5. I did like the way the book flowed. I feel like it's a little slower in the middle, but you can understand that, or rather justify it, with the relationship being developed between Jericho and Atticus. And then we obviously have the world building. Yeah, it's not particularly special about the world building. I just give it a 3 out of 5 on that one, which leaves this book with a 3.5 out of 5. I think that's a pretty fair ranking. I'm actually looking forward more to the twins next. Although I did really enjoy Jericho as a character, I'll enjoy seeing him again. Atticus, I didn't really care for all that much. I just thought he was a bit of a bland character. So yeah, I'm more interested in seeing one of the wilder psychopaths like the twins and see how they play out in the page. So yeah, keep an eye out for that.